Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Training Magazine Network event, 7 Ways to Virtualize Your Training with Tom Masato, VP Virtual Learning at On24. Thank you so much for joining us here today. It's going to be a great session. And just a reminder that we do record all of the events here at Training Magazine Network, and this is no exception. This recording will be available within 24 hours after today's session. And just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get things started. I'd like to mention that the webinar console that you see that you're looking at can be completely customized, the console at the bottom of your screen. You can resize or move any of the windows that you have open. There are also a number of interactive buttons on the bottom of your screen that we would encourage you to explore, including the resources button where you can find the slides from today's presentation, as well as several virtual training white papers. And then at the end of today's webcast, there will also be a Q&A session where you can submit questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A button. You will also see a Twitter button on the console. If you'd like to tweet about today's event, please use the hashtag virtual training. No space, just hashtag virtual training. And then you'll receive an email notification when this webinar will be available on demand. And just a couple of other reminders today. Don't forget that Tom Masato returns on May 9th with using gamification to enhance the learning experience. Go to trainingmagnetwork.com/calendar for more information, and we'd like to have you, of course, welcome you to register for this upcoming special On24 event. And where can you find more information about recordings and all of the resources available to you? Well, it's at trainingmagnetwork.com, available to you 24/7. Click on the right-hand side. You'll see the calendar of upcoming free webinars and also the recorded webinar archive with years of great free resources, including free white papers. So go to trainingmagnetwork.com/calendar or just the trainingmagnetwork.com homepage and look on the right-hand side. And now I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Tom Masato is VP Virtual Learning at On24, and as the Vice President of Virtual Learning Strategy, Tom Masato leads and evangelizes On24's product strategy for virtual learning, new hire onboarding, and leadership development. A recognized expert on virtual strategies, Masato is featured speaker for ATD, Chief Learning Officer, Training Industry, and Training Magazine, where he discusses enabling technologies and best practices for virtual training, onboarding, social learning, and mobile learning. So now, let's get today's event started. Tom?
Thanks, Philip. And thanks, everyone, for joining today's webinar titled 7 Ways to Virtualize Your Training. As the title suggests, we are going to walk through 7 best practices for looking at basically how to enhance your existing in-person training programs or to take your virtual training programs to the next level. We'll touch upon each of these sections in a structure that's very similar. We'll initially, as we discuss each section, we'll initially talk about some of the drivers and challenges which are basically laying the foundation for the recommendation. Then we'll talk about some of the tactics and different components and elements of the best practice being recommended. We'll start with talking about webinars and their use for the advantages of using them for your virtual classrooms. We'll look at simplifying your sort of training experience, both by centralizing access to your content, as well as actually providing more of a consumer-like experience. We'll look at engagement from a number of different perspectives, both from the virtual sort of the interactivity and networking perspective, looking at how gamification can improve engagement, as well as personalization. And then we'll close out today's webinar with a discussion of the drivers for virtual onboarding and some of the benefits associated with that. As Philip mentioned, feel free to enter your questions at any time, and we'll get to that in a Q&A session at the end. Before I jump into the first section, I do have a question out for today's audience, which is, what are your top training objectives? Please select all that apply. The options are, reduce your training costs, make your training programs more engaging, simplify access to your training materials, deliver more consistent training globally, include gamification to make learning more interactive and entertaining, add informal learning or coaching to your training programs. Please enter all of the options that apply. Again, the question is, what are your top training objectives? And the options are, reduce your training costs, make your training programs more engaging, simplify access to your training materials, deliver more consistent training globally, include gamification to make learning more interactive and entertaining, add informal learning or coaching to your training programs. All right, I'll give it a moment or two extra, so make sure that everybody can get their sort of responses submitted, and then we'll sort of take a look at whether the results that we're seeing today are similar to what we've seen in the past, or if there's any sort of different aspects of it. So going once, going twice. All right, let's take a look at our results. So not surprisingly, we do see engagement, or improving the engagement level of training programs being number one, and with about the same percentage that we typically see. Roughly 9 out of 10 of the times that we, of the people that take this poll are looking at improving the engagement of the training programs. What's a little bit different for today's poll is the informal learning and coaching being exactly half of the audience saying one of their top objectives. We generally don't see that high. We do definitely see gamification, simplification being consistently sort of in the second and third place. But I think the main difference with today's results are the interest in informal learning and coaching, and the addition of those capabilities to your training programs. Again, thank you everyone for your responses, and let's get into our first section of today's presentation. So we're going to look at basically why we recommend that webinars be considered for your virtual classrooms. So this next sort of slide will not surprise anyone as looking at the costs associated with the virtual training relative to in-person training. Fairly straightforward that if you move things to be virtual, your costs can be significantly reduced, and you can see some results that a number of our clients actually have achieved in making this switch. Now, webinars are not the only solution for moving things virtual. Learning management systems have been around for about 15 to 20 years. E-learning has been available where you can actually do it, self-paced, online training. But there's a couple different aspects that webinars really provide that e-learning typically does not provide. One of which is live delivery. Going through and actually have a live virtual instructor-led training. Most of the e-learning content is on demand. There are a couple of different cases, or in some cases, people are actually making sort of live elements associated with it, but most of the e-learning is on demand. The other real difference, and we'll talk about this in sort of a couple different sections in a little more detail, that with webinar-based technology, you can actually make it much more interactive, actually keep the attentiveness higher, and have more engaging presentation. So So one of the key sort of drivers with respect to looking at webinars for your virtual classrooms or virtual instructor-led training is to keep the interactive level high, the engagement level high, and provide some of their capabilities that we'll talk about. And one of the main areas, so reduction of cost, we talked about moving virtually. One of the areas that webinars are also very capable of doing is delivering to large audiences. So if you have maybe a division, training to a large division, maybe if you actually have scenarios where you're training your sales force or training a partner base, you may actually have a very large audience that you're providing the training to. So webinars are a great vehicle to extend your reach of your training to large audiences. Webinars are also nice from the standpoint of for content, sort of live presentations or live training that you're delivering, but the training being repetitive in nature. So the ability for using webinars to pre-record your content, but then deliver that as if it were a live webinar is really allows you to improve not only your productivity, but improve the flexibility basically of scheduling your training. Particularly important for repetitive content, where you can record it once, replay it multiple times as if it were live with live Q&A at the end of it, so we can actually allow that capability to deliver. So it's a nice thing from the standpoint, particularly as you look at repetitive live training, the ability to do a simulated live webinar with that pre-recording, but also adding a live Q&A is a nice advantage of the webinar-based virtual classrooms. The other aspect is you're really sort of experiencing today. Webinars have the ability to have more of an interactive and personalized presentation to the user. As Phil mentioned through the housekeeping, you have the ability to move windows around, minimize them, determine basically what information you'd like to see, interact with the various different elements which are available on that lower dock area, which includes social media and some other things. So the ability to personalize your experience for each individual attendee, to personalize that experience, is a nice way of actually, again, improving the engagement level of that the individuals participating within your training. The number of options available for sort of interactive features are also another way engagement actually is improved. And we'll talk about sort of the connection between interactivity and engagement a little bit later in one of our sections. But you can see from today's presentation or webinar that we have speaker bio included, which not only provides background on the speaker, but allows you to either connect with them on LinkedIn or maybe follow them on Twitter, their Twitter page. We have Q&A for posing your questions. We include resources, so we have some white papers as well as the presentation from today's webinar. And we include also social media, both Twitter and LinkedIn, as part of our console today. You can see from this list, there's a number of other capabilities that can be, features that can be included on the webinar console as well, including tests with automated correction. Last but not least, within the sort of webinar recommendations, if you are actually looking at certification programs, continuing professional education, maybe you have continuing legal education, depending upon your industry or the type of your profession. So certified training is actually one of the common use cases for webinars, which can be very specifically have requirements for certification that you can specify, and based upon the individual achieving that certification, certificates can be issued as well. So if you have certification programs that you're looking at, whether that be sort of formal CPE versus certification on different parts of your organization, or different parts of your technologies or other parts of information that you're conveying, webinars are a great vehicle for that. let's look at the second section, or second recommendation, using virtual environments to centralize your training content. So what is the driver of sort of the notion of centralization, or why is centralization important, and what benefit does it provide? Well, if you look at the sort of, the training space today, there are a lot of organizations, don't necessarily have a singular place where the training content resides. And that was really the sort of, I think, the driving value proposition as learning management systems sort of came into popularity. But if you look at the space today, it actually, while corporate learning management systems are still a key repository of training, it's not the only one. So organizations very often, or learners very often, have to go to, other locations for training. So maybe you are licensing third-party training content, which is in a separate area. You may have pre-work or post-work on your SharePoint or intranet. You may have other sort of shared file systems or knowledge management systems where content resides. So there's generally more than one location that's required for an individual to go to either take optional or required training, which can be a complex problem. And particularly as you're trying to encourage optional training and skills development, you want to make it as simple as possible for the learner to be able to take that coursework. So this need to sort of centralize or provide a more intuitive way of accessing your training content, and this is, I think, roughly half of today's poll respondents said that, simplifying the way in which training can be accessed is a key objective for them. So some solution that sort of, as I refer to, sort of intermediary between the learner and these various different content repositories is very important, such that you have that central place that people can go, or a one-stop shop that people can go to for their training. Now, the content still resides within these sources. There's a very important reason why they're typically placed in these different areas, but allowing the ability for someone to go to one place and access the various different materials that are available to them is an important simplification, or greatly simplifies the process for accessing that content. So the virtual learning environment, which was suggested in the prior slide, is exactly that. It provides a single point of access to whatever your training information be, whether that be live webinars, self-paced training, content that resides within the learning management system, networking, job aids, other training materials. So you can really have a wide range of different types of media and materials you want to make available to your audience, but you can provide it basically access to that information from a simple, sort of intuitive sort of presentation that is designed to be very simple to access, but allow you to actually get the training from multiple different repositories. Let's drill into that a little bit more detail as it pertains to learning management systems. So the corporate learning management system has some really great advantages, right? It has some really good administrative tools around, as well as reporting, tracking manager notifications, of course, tracking course completions, and your timing associated with completing the courses. And of course, it houses the LMS-based courses as well as those assessments that are used to track course completion. The area where learning management systems sort of fall down, and we'll talk about this also in a little more detail, is the user experience. Making that more intuitive way in which you can access the content that resides not only within the LMS, but also within those other training repositories which are in different locations. So not only is the virtual learning environment, bring those together to centralize access, it's providing basically a better user experience, a more intuitive way in which those materials can be accessed. So looking at basically a virtual learning environment, sort of summarize some of the capabilities that are included, is you have a very familiar set of virtual locations. You can include live and self-paced training, a lot of networking interactivity as well as gamification, which we'll talk about in more detail a little bit later. Supports global access as well as having administrative and real-time reporting capabilities. So it really provides a foundation for, again, a more intuitive, simple way of accessing training that may reside in multiple locations within your training environment. So we talked about basically use of webinars and the advantages of them for your virtual classrooms. We looked at basically how we can centralize and simplify access to your training content. But now let's talk a little bit about, how the basically consumer technology has changed the expectations of business learners and what the ramifications are to your training programs. So the driver or challenge is really that consumer technology has spoiled business users. I'm sure that everybody on today's webinar has a smartphone. Probably have at home. They probably have wireless speakers for listening to their playlists. Maybe they had sort of a wide variety of different consumer technology that they utilize in their home life. But so now those sort of simple devices, those sort of sleek designs, are really influencing how business learners or the expectations of business learners within the workplace. Specifically, some of those expectations include the design of the experience, the ability to actually to access immediately, the capability and not have to learn and take a read or go through an instruction guide to figure out how to use something. As well as the pervasive of social networking and social media within the workplace and the training programs. So these consumer expectations have really changed basically how people are looking at technology within the workplace, as well as their expectations for the experiences that they should have. Now you take that and you look at what the typical or a common tool is for delivering training is the learning management system. It's the exact opposite of what those expectations are, is what is manifested within the learning interface available for the business learner. So the majority of complaints that organizations have really pertains to usability of it. Not necessarily from an administrative perspective, but usability from a user perspective. It's confusing. When you search for information, it gives you like a Google-like results of many, many, many different options. Very linear, very static. Essentially not necessarily a particularly enjoyable experience and confusing to the learner. So you may ask that, well, how do we actually bring these two solutions together? We have this need for these expectations, or they have these expectations which are in the workplace. We have a learning management system that not really comes up to sort of solve that. So that's where that virtual learning environment comes in the picture as an intermediary to provide that, again, not only that centralization, but also simplification and designs or experiences that are really meeting the objectives or the expectations of the learners. Let's talk a little more specifically about the key objectives. So sleek design. With the virtual learning environment, you can really provide an experience which is very intuitive and familiar to your target audience. So on the left, part of an onboarding program, they're using a network cafe to encourage networking and collaboration amongst the new hires. On the right-hand side, providing training out to a dealership, both on the sales and service side. The experience that they're providing is something familiar to them as basically working within or walking around the dealership. So sleek design, important aspect of that is intuitive and familiar experiences that the learner goes through to find the information and training that they're looking for. In addition to that, we're looking at basically part of the self-service, the second objective being self-service, has two components to it. The first part is a little bit thing I alluded to a little bit earlier. I don't want to have to read an instruction manual to learn how to actually use the interface or how to find the information I'm looking for. I'd like to be able to go to the learning interface and provide a little welcome message, give a little bit of an orientation that's available within the environment, and then be able to be fully self-sufficient in finding the information or training that I'm looking for. In addition to that, self-service really means that anywhere I am, anytime I want to take training, on any device that I want to take training on, I should be able to do that. So the ability to support or access the training through a mobile device, tablet, as well as actually a sort of optimized interface for mobile phones should be available as part of the learning experience. So self-service has that capability of saying, be able to go in and do it immediately without any instruction, but also and do that on any device that I have available or would like to take the training on. And last but not least, the sort of social media, social networking, whether that be LinkedIn or Twitter or Instagrams or whatever sort of vehicle that you'd like to use, should be part of your training program and allow you the opportunity to share with others, connect with others, or basically essentially enhance your training experience. Okay, let's look at recommendation number 4. And 4, 5, and 6 have a sort of a common theme through each of them. It's really about engagement, improving the engagement of it. And if you remember from our poll results, roughly 9 out of 10 of the poll respondents basically said, improving the engagement of the training programs is a top objective. So let's look at engagement and improving engagement from a few different perspectives. The first one looking at interactivity and networking. So why is interactivity and network important? So if you look at studies as well as the work that we do with our clients and organizations that we work with, you'll see that there's a direct correlation between interactivity and networking and the level of user engagement. More specifically, user engagement is directly correlated to the level of networking and the amount of interactivity within the learning experience. Higher the interactivity, the greater the networking, the higher the user engagement. So in looking at your training programs, if you want to improve the engagement of that, you have to look at the interactive elements that are available as well as ways in which people can network within the training experience. Let's talk about a few things that we recommend or typically see to improve the level of interactivity and networking within training programs. The first being, we talked about this and you're experiencing it today, the level of interactivity that you can do within webinar-based virtual classrooms. So I won't spend much time on this. We had a whole section of that earlier, but that is one of the tools available to improve that level of interactivity. There are also capabilities that are available which are designed more for individuals sort of being within the environment by themselves or with small groups, where they're not necessarily together in a larger group, maybe sitting within a virtual classroom together. They're actually going through some on-demand or self-paced training, but they still want to actually have some level, or you want to encourage them to have some level of interactivity within that experience. So it may be forums, as illustrated on the left, where you can submit questions or participate within discussions around various different forum topics. Alternatively, it may be more brainstorming or idea storming, where you are responding to a question which is being posed to you with either ideas or comments, or simply cast your vote into what you think the suggestions of others are the best ones versus the worst ones. Interactivity can be simple. So, maybe walking through a video carousel where you can simply click on the different thumbnails and they move to the center area where you can watch the videos. So simple interactivity is certainly also advantageous as you're looking at improving the learner's sort of actions and activity within your training program. And then last but not least, you can look at things, interactivity from other ways as well. Some things around blogs. The one on the right is something I think lately I've seen a little bit more of, where you have 360-degree videos that you can move around within the video, try to look at it from different perspectives. Again, other ways in which interactive elements can be incorporated into your training program. Looking at networking, shifting gears a little bit to look at networking, we have webcam scheduled chats, which are a great way for informal training. So some of the, I think roughly 1 out of 2 people that responded said they want to have more informal learning, more coaching within the programs. This is a great vehicle for both of those things, allowing an individual or a few individuals to be available on webcam who can be seen and heard. They can respond to questions which are being posed via text chat or discussion points that are entered via text chat, which is shown to the sort of upper left area that everybody can see, and they can be heard and seen in their responses and facilitate those discussions. So great for coaching and mentoring, informal learning, having subject matter experts share their areas of expertise, or maybe just simply a fireside chat with your leadership, having a Q&A session. A number of different ways in which this capability is utilized to improve the networking and interaction with others. Social media, one-on-one chats, again, I won't discuss this too much. We've sort of touched upon that already in the ways in which it can basically encourage people to interact. And then last but not least, networking, the ability to actually search for others based upon certain criteria, maybe their job function, their title, their areas of expertise, or other criteria that you think are important to make available. And then once individuals that match that criteria are basically shown, the individual searching for them can either choose to exchange a business card with them, send them a message, or if they're online, interact with them on a one-on-one manner. Again, different ways of actually encouraging people of like interests or people around interested in common communities or communities of practice to interact amongst themselves and, again, improve the networking level of networking within your training program. I switched gears a little bit, look at engagement from a little different perspective. Particularly, we're going to talk about gamification and the value of using sort of game-like experiences to improve the engagement, knowledge retention, in some of their areas. So the drivers for gamification are the ones that you see here. A lot of very strong business objectives or business improvement that you can achieve by incorporating gamification into the workplace. As you see here, improvements around engagement, productivity, clarity of objectives, and basically knowledge retention. So key values that as you bring in gamification into your training programs or other areas of the workplace has very positive benefits to the organization. Let's look at some of the elements of gamification which are very common and typical. So gamification programs, which are, a lot of times are also motivators for people to do optional training, the foundation of that is a point system. As you can see illustrated, you have a number of different activities, and associated with the completion of those activities, you have a set of points or a value associated with them. So I may have a general activity, such as participate in a general group chat or view any document that is very general nature. I typically like to recommend more specific activities, such as spending a certain duration within a breakout room, or watching a specific duration of a particular webinar. Those things are things which are unique. You can do it once, and you have a point value that you can define associated with the completion of any of those activities. So once the activities are defined that you want people to do, and you have points assigned with them, the system automatically accumulates the points based upon an individual completing those activities. So from this example, I have 730 points that have accumulated for completing the activities which have been defined. Now, the motivation comes in through leaderboards or giveaways to encourage people to complete the activities you defined. You may have giveaways or a drawing associated with achieving certain levels based upon certain point levels that make you eligible for that giveaway. Or you may, which you more commonly see, some level of competitiveness and the level of basically simply providing leaderboard with different rankings are enough to encourage people to basically complete more activities based upon that. So individuals can be ranked relative to others. You can also have rankings relative to teams associated as well. Now, you take it a little one step further. So now you have the point system. You have the leaderboards. So how do you take it a little bit further with respect to gamification? And that really comes down to the visuals. So in this example, they use the gamification point system and leaderboards, but they structured it as part of a multi sort of degree program for their training. You know, basically the apprentice, the general training, and then the master classes associated with that. We also see, I think, fairly commonly, this I think is probably the most common one that we see is for gamification, is incorporate some sort of trivia or Jeopardy game as part of your either knowledge assessment to encourage people to become more familiar with the organization or some of the leadership and the history or culture about it. So it actually has some, again, positive benefits, as we mentioned earlier about gamification, but presented in a style or way that, again, really encourages that sort of game-like feel. And then last but not least, we see scavenger hunts, which are, I think, a good tool, particularly as you're trying to familiarize your learners with the available training within an environment, or you want them to encourage them to sort of view different areas. Scavenger hunts are a great vehicle for doing that. Now we're heading into the home stretch. We're going to talk about personalization and then virtual onboarding. We'll have about 15 minutes or so minutes to go through a Q&A. So if you haven't asked a question as of yet, I'd like to remind you that to use the Q&A feature to enter in at any time, and we'll get to those those questions at the end. All right, let's round out our section on engagement, talking about personalization of training. Again, let's look at the drivers for this recommendation. So if you look at basically some of the things we talked about, this notion of centralization earlier, centralized access to simplify a learner's access to training, make it more intuitive. That notion of centralization is really important, but personalization also needs to be layered on top of that because you have multiple audiences with different training needs. You also have the desire for learners to actually only look at information that pertains to them rather than a laundry list of information. One of the things we talked about in the context of learning management systems, giving a huge list of all the possible different options available, but I only want to actually see the things which are pertinent to me. And the last, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, personalization improves the user engagement. So by personalizing it, you're going to have a more engaged audience. Talked about that a little bit in your experience and a little bit with that user control within today's webinar, but we'll talk about some other areas that we use personalization with respect to your training program. When the key-based, and we'll talk about this as sort of role-based, based upon your role or your position or your hierarchy, or roles can be anything. But the idea is using a particular role to basically tailor an experience or information based upon that role. So with respect to roles or personalization, you can use that to drive learners to different areas. So for example, new hires versus managers versus executives, some of their categorization can take them through a different experience which is uniquely associated with that role. You also use roles of personalization to tailor basically the training or information available to specific groups. So again, in the contrast of functional roles, you have marketing versus sales, and the training may differ based upon those sort of functional categorization. Roles can also be tied to language preferences. Based upon the preference that you've chose for language, the environment or the experience can be changed to be in that language of choice, as well as actually things around event time zones and other sort of things can be done and actually changed in real time. Last but not least, notifications and other sort of things that are basically sent out to you can also be role-based, so that things that you are alerted to can only be are only specific to the role, and not being basically given, say, an update on new content that's applicable to everybody or applicable to multiple different roles, and you have basically notifications of content which are not applicable to you or not accessible to you. So around personalization around notifications is also important to keep that engagement level high. All right, let's look at the last section. We're moving off of the engagement sort of a set of different topics. We're going to talk about a little bit about virtual onboarding and why we are recommending this as part of your training programs that you have. Similar to gamification, so we're looking at onboarding in general. And we're looking at a formal onboarding program of the results you see here, or for a formal onboarding program, which is at least 6 months in length. So if you have a program that's formal, 6 months in length, you have a number of really positive benefits to your organization for having that onboarding program around productivity, retention, manager and employee satisfaction, as well as achievement of goals, as noted here. So onboarding in general, whether we're not looking at delivery of in-person versus virtual, we're looking at it from the standpoint of formal and 6 months in length has very positive benefits to your organization. But why virtual onboarding? That's sort of that's the recommendation that we're making within this best practice is you should look at a virtual onboarding program. Why is that something we're recommending? Well, first of all, as you look at the millennial generation, which is ages 20 to 36. So if you're age 20 to 36, you are considered part of the millennial generation. And if you look at that generation, today they are influencing a lot of today's business technology decisions because they are the largest generation within the U.S. workforce. Some of the characteristics associated with being millennials is they don't want to sit in a classroom. They don't do paperwork. They like interactive sort of forms of learning because they've grown up with technology. So they're really sort of key things that virtual onboarding is important, or really, again, to reach, not only reach that audience and effectively train them, but also it pertains to the recruitment of millennials. Having a virtual onboarding program is an attractive recruitment vehicle. So these are some of the key things, but millennials in particular are driving basically the move to virtual onboarding. Other sort of secondary sort of influences of globalization and people working from geographically dispersed locations, having virtual teams. There's a number of different sort of influences or drivers to virtual onboarding. The biggest one being the millennial generation and their particular interest in how training is being delivered to them. As you look at virtual onboarding, there's a lot of quality benefits around consistency, engagement. The ability to actually have a longer onboarding program is actually easier done with a virtual program. It meets those interests of the millennials, as well as actually improves new hires assimilation, both socially and culturally, but being delivered in a virtual manner. It also has some very hard benefits you can do from a hard ROI around movement from in-person to virtual, improving the retention of the new hires, as well as improving time to proficiency. So significant ROI or business case be made to move to virtual with very specific cost-saving dollars, as you can see here. All right, let's round it out this sort of section and sort of today's webinar with just one quick case study of an organization who has made the move from in-person into virtual with very successful results. This particular financial services firm hires over 1,600 people, new hires per year. Because of the volume of new hires and the geographic locations that they have, it was very expensive, or it was too expensive for them to have a formal onboarding program. So the process was informal, impersonal, heavily reliant on the hiring manager and his or her abilities to actually onboard basically the new hires into the organization. They moved to virtual. They improved a consistency of the program. They're accelerating new hires' time to proficiency. They're also including pre-boarding as well as onboarding, so they're bringing in basically a pre-boarding aspect to improve their essentially their hire to show up conversion. In comparison to a rollout of an in-person program, which they couldn't do, but relative to virtual, if they did in-person to virtual, it's a difference of $4 million per year. Significant business benefits, not only from the standpoint of engagement, consistency, acceleration, retention, but also cost savings. Quick recap, and then we'll hit one final poll, and then we'll go into our Q&A session. Again, quick reminder, if you haven't entered your question, feel free to do it at any time, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. Just to recap what we walked through, we talked about recommendations, or why we're recommending interactive webinar-based tools for virtual classrooms. We discussed the drivers as well as the specific elements of centralizing your training content to simplify access and make it more intuitive training experience. We talked about basically the consumer-like expectations that you're having within the home that are influencing the experiences and the expectations within the workplace. We rounded out had three different sections on engagement that looked at interactivity, networking, gamification, as well as actually personalization. And we finally just concluded our webinar presentation with a discussion of virtual onboarding and its importance to basically the millennial generation in today's organization. Before we get to the Q&A, I'm going to basically close with one last poll that I appreciate your response to. And the question is, and I'll leave this up for a moment as we get into the Q&A. The question is, would you like to learn more about how organizations are using virtual environments for their training programs? Case studies, other sort of best practices, ways in which sort of actual client organizations are looking at different programs and the benefits they're achieving are some of the things that additional information that is available to learn how organizations are using virtual environments. Simple yes or no question. Again, the question is, would you like to learn more about how organizations are using virtual environments for their training programs? With that, I'm going to sort of roll it back to Phil to look at today's questions, and we'll get to as many as we can in sort of the closing part of today's session.
Great, Tom. Thanks. We have a question from Christine, and she asks, how do you account for those not comfortable with technology in virtual onboarding? Could this have the opposite effect of those that aren't comfortable using technology computers?
We haven't really found that as of yet. We definitely do get the question about the use of sort of virtual technologies with the different generations which are in the workplace, both the millennials, which are on the sort of the earlier side, and maybe some of the baby boomers, which are on the sort of latter side. And we've definitely seen use and basically and sort of interest in virtual technologies from all the generations. The use of it, or the amount of use around some of the networking interactive elements may be greater for millennials versus baby boomers, but we haven't seen necessary things from the virtual technologies that are discouraging people because it provides a convenient way of accessing information and training in a convenient manner and actually from anywhere they want to actually access it.
I see. Great. Thank you, Tom. And Wendy asks or points out that they've been digitizing their onboarding. They're in higher education, and the preparation of that is going well. But the current snag is around finding a good method, place, or tool to have a shared checklist. She mentions that the new facility needs to see and get familiar with the various areas of the college, the dean, the chair, the faculty member, and faculty development, and need to share this document. Do you have any suggestions there?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's sort of a standard part of sort of virtual onboarding and programs that we see with that, have a virtual environment or some tool like that, is having a task list. A lot of the onboarding programs we do have a little bit more of a flow that's chronologically based. That could be as if you're walking through a path, or it could be sort of more task-oriented. But we see that as a pretty common requirement or capability that organizations have, whether it's higher ed or other sort of corporations, where there's a certain set of things that people need to sort of walk through and check off. And then the way that the task can be organized, it sort of facilitates or points you to the places or resources that you need to do as part of that task completion. So pretty common capability we see within virtual onboarding within a virtual environment.
All right. Thank you, Tom. And Ken asks or points out that he's read that gamification works best when participants are rewarded with something tangible, like access to additional resources rather than badges. What do you think?
Yeah, I think rewards are actually, definitely I think people respond better to, a set of activities being completed if there is some sort of, not, I would say gift isn't the right one, but some sort of a reward at the end of the process or as part of the process. We definitely see that. Badges, they're nice to have. They're, I think, more of a visual component. I think there is interest in the notion of badges, but I would agree that with Ken that if you had something where at the end of that process you were rewarded with something, then that is definitely going to be a higher motivator. One of the examples I showed, I think, in part of the gamification section was this multi-degree program, or the program that had, the apprentice and the undergraduate and the graduate programs, and with rewards associated with each of them, and that works quite effectively in their program.
Good. And Bill asks, what is the comparison of development time for virtual versus traditional ILT and WBT?
Yeah, it actually can be, depending upon the technologies that you use for your, instructor-led training, it's probably about the same, in the sense that the virtual instructor-led training is more or less taking the same training materials, delivering them virtually versus in person. Depending upon the sort of the e-learning tool that you're using, the creation of on-demand content from a webinar tool relative to maybe a scoring-based tool can be actually much shorter. So it depends a little bit on some of the tools that you're looking at around development time. So virtual classrooms versus instructor-led training, about the same. You're still preparing. The vast majority of that time of development is creating out, say, the presentation or instructional materials. Around on-demand content, there are some tools that are used that our webinars have within them that can simplify the process of creating on-demand content relative to e-learning based content using a SCORM-like package like Articulate or Storyline.
Okay, good. Thank you. And another question is there anything that we need to consider when designing for generational cohorts, like baby boomers versus Y versus Gen X?
I think there's, if you are, designing for a specific generation. So say, for example, the program that you're doing is maybe a virtual onboarding program for new college graduates. And you know that those new college graduates are going to be in the millennial generation that's specifically who you're targeting. You may actually have more elements that they're going to be either not expect or more likely to use. So more interactivity, more networking, more other elements that are really going to highly engage that audience. If you're looking at a virtual program that spans multiple generations, then you're going to want to consider making sure that it's intuitive for all the various different users. And I think it refers a little bit back to a question which was earlier about familiarity with the technology for people who may be not as accustomed to using technology as others, that making that a very intuitive process to find the training and find the information that's available to them, I think is a key consideration as you look at spanning multiple generations.
Good, thank you. And another question is, so with the environment, there appear to be so many options for a new employee, webcast, e-learnings, etc., and it looks so overwhelming. How do you onboard new folks to this environment, for example, steering them into the right direction through all of the resources?
Yeah, so a couple of comments regarding this question. Is there definitely a lot of different capabilities that can be incorporated, and part of the process is understanding the things which are most applicable to your target audience. So you don't need to necessarily take all the recommendations. You take the ones that you think have the most impact for the audience that you're providing training to. And then there's a couple different ways in which we've seen organizations do it. Definitely having a welcome message and a little bit of an orientation upon first entry into the environment is a very good tactic that we see. And that walkthrough and orientation is only a minute to a minute and a half in length, so not really too long. These walkthrough and sort of orientation can also be broken up into a separate video that can be dispersed to people that familiarizes them with, the sort of environment that you have prior to going to it. So there's a few different techniques that can be used to make sure that people are familiar and comfortable. We have found with the training programs that we typically do, having that little bit of that welcome message and orientation at the beginning is sufficient to provide the appropriate information or background for people to then go into a self-service manner to find the information or training that they're looking for.
Great. And would you like one more question, Tom?
Sounds good.
Great. What are the indicators, metrics, which we should track to measure the impact of our initiatives?
Yeah, that's a tough question because it really varies depending upon the program that you're doing. What you look at from the standpoint of, maybe an onboarding program versus a leadership development versus maybe sort of, corporate communication program would really vary. I think a couple of things that we see fairly common across the different use cases are, of course, usage, popularity of content or content usage, activity of the individuals, how long they're in the environment are some of the metrics that we see. So really get an understanding of frequency of use and of the information made available to them, what is more commonly basically utilized, and those, regardless of the application, that information is valuable to understand how to optimize the program, as well as actually enhance the content, the training materials to be made available to your audience.
Great, Tom. Thank you so much, and thank you for a great presentation today on the subject of virtual training. And we'd like to also thank On24 for making today's presentation possible and providing today's platform. So thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Bill. And of course, thanks everyone for taking the time to listen to today's webinar.
And don't forget that Tom will return at trainingmagnetwork.com on May 9th, and go to trainingmagnetwork.com to register for Tom's next event and On24's next event. Thank you, everyone.